You're listening to The Adventuring Party, talking about gaming the Irish way. Quick editor's note before we start. There's a little bit of glitchiness at the start of this one on Kiffer's track, but don't worry, it all clears up when we get straight into the insights and gaming goodness for the weapon design episode. Enjoy!
Welcome to the party. I'm Owen.
I'm Shane.
And today we have with us a noted member of the Irish gaming community, a long-term listener, an ally to us in many a troubled time, and a public eater of snacks. Welcome to the party, Kiffer.
Hi guys, long-time listener, first-time caller. Here to talk with you today. My name's Kiffer Geo, and I stream on Twitch under the name Kiffer Geo. And I used to be involved with running GaelCon and a couple of other events around Dublin. Yeah.
And if you ever want to see someone struggle against the would you call it a smorgasbord or a plague of 90s second edition and first edition?
I would definitely call it a plague. There is an absolute disaster field of available late 80s, early 90s RPG games, based very faithfully, in some cases, on the systems available at the time, and sometimes with a twist. I think if we look, if we look at the early D&D games that were available on PC and Atari ST and Amiga, Pool of Radiance, on as far as Pools of Darkness, Curse of the Azure Bonds, that Gold Box series, they implemented systems very faithfully, and so create a garbage field of good and bad games using RPG systems that were available.
The type of game where you send you running back to XCOM as your comfort food.
They send you back to XCOM as your comfort food, of course. And I think when the people making those games implemented them, they took a lot of things to heart. The random encounter tables implemented as if that was the way the game should be played. Oh, you've encountered an encounter. It is 15 bugbears and they're, trained dogs, and you've got another encounter. You've committed a crime in the village. Here are 60 town guard and 15 wizards with them. Each of the wizards is capable of wizarding as much as your wizard. Have at it.
They read those modules then when they were writing it up.
If you ever wanted to watch a man live hex edit a game so you can actually play it successfully, this is the stream for you.
We try to avoid that.
Yeah. And of course, there's always the wonderful. Is it 10 o'clock the snack comes out?
It is 11 Irish time, which for some viewers is midnight, and I think it's for the Americans it might be sort of dinner time, like a dessert.
But yes, what we're saying is that Kiffer has international acclaim, and we do feel it's good to put him out. But to sort of segue a little bit, one of the big things I always notice when I check your streams is the amount of time that you're having to go into every character's individualized inventory and micromanage their wands, their +3 broadswords, and all this stuff. And surely wouldn't it be better if just there was, a best weapon that you could just equip to a person permanently and never have to change? Would that not be superior weapon design? And I can already hear Owen's, suppressed.
Oh, I'm warming up. Listen, today we are here to discuss weapon design and how weapon design, in my opinion, has started to go down a rabbit hole for some time and has now figured out, oh dear, we're now stuck in a rabbit hole. We have to start reversing out in a slightly awkward fashion. there has been long a push across nearly every RPG to simplify down weapons and often boil weapons down to just a damage value. If you look across most modern RPGs, you'll see a lot of weapons which are literally just a damage value, and then they maybe have a trait for the type of damage they do, and then they suddenly realize that, wow, we've dug a bit of a hole for ourselves here. Give you an example. In D&D, what damage does a dagger do?
Dagger is a D4.
Who uses daggers?
Sneaky people. Wizards.
Does any character use daggers? Wizards might use it because they have weapon restrictions to artificially restrict them to a smaller class of weapons. But do rogues use daggers?
No, they use rapier every time.
Why don't they use a dagger?
Because it only does a D4.
Yeah. So what does a rapier do then?
Rapier does a D8.
Yeah.
And you still add your dex. It does everything a dagger does, but twice as much of it.
Basically. So weapon design, they focused on simplification. And they boiled everything down to a damage value. And as a result of doing that, some weapons just become not usable. Doesn't matter if in real life they had uses. Doesn't matter if they were kind of cool or useful. They just don't see it anymore. Spears. Are spears a good weapon in real life?
They are one of the best weapons that have lasted us for thousands of years.
Absolutely, one of the best ones. In D&D, are spears good weapons?
No.
Why not?
Because the only real advantage they have is that they have reach, and in most modern rule sets, reach no longer has a particular value, so it's better to just take the long sword that does more damage.
Pretty much, right?
Or a higher chance of getting a +1 magic weapon, but that's a question.
Yeah, so go on.
I will say that what the dagger has, and often the spear has, depending on which spear we're talking about, is the thrown property. Sorry, excuse me, hold on. It has the thrown property, so you can throw it. If you find yourself short of movement, you're a little bit too far away, throw the dagger. You couldn't throw the rapier.
But if you're a rogue, you can just take that free bonus action to...
Oh, yeah. Free item interaction, take out the dagger, throw the dagger. It doesn't matter that you had the rapier in your other hand.
It is definitely a thing. So, for what I see, it's everyone decided it'd be simpler if weapons were less complicated. Because in the old days, weapons used to have a bunch of extra funkiness to them. Sometimes weapons had rate, where they would basically go, this attacks twice a round, or this attacks 3 times every 2 rounds, or this attacks basically, this has a different quality against larger creatures, or this is better because it has reach, And that's it's gone away more or less, right? Like it's kind of been very much pulled down and minimized, and we'll just do damage values.
Now, all of those things are gone. Yeah.
Yeah. And you might think, that's a good thing. It's simpler. And I'll tell you this, it's making the first session simpler. It is absolutely making the first session simpler and picking out your first weapon simpler. But after that, you starting to have issues because all of a sudden, only a small number of weapons see play. So players kind of get constrained down to using those weapons. If I look through the D&D 5th Ed book, I could pick out probably the 6 weapons that see a lot of use, and most of the rest of the weapons are corner case. You kind of have to invent situations why they're used. Maybe it's weapon restrictions on classes. Maybe it's something like a favored weapon for someone who's worships a god. And that's mostly what pulls some of those other weapons up. Maybe you go, okay, everyone here is resistant to slashing damage. So I guess we have to get the piercing weapons out now. And that's kind of the extent of it. And it's gotten so bad and made it so hard to design new weapons that if you look at what's happening with D&D Next, and that already happened with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, is that they have to invent traits. And you give traits to weapons, which are like a little bit of extra rule stuff that you have to remember that your weapon does. Maybe the hammers get to knock people prone on a crit, or maybe like firearms stun people on a crit. And stuff like that. Or maybe it's got the finesse trait. You can use your dex instead of your strength to attack this with melee. or this is agile, it's slightly better at making a second or third attack.
Yeah, all interesting properties, but the kind that if you're really in the heat of the moment, a lot of people will just overlook them, and then 2 turns later, going, "Oh wait, I had this trait.
Yeah.
Oh, I should have used that, and it'd be done this, and it'd been great and be awesome." And then the fact that the weapon has this trait stops being a bonus and seems more like a trap because it just leads to this disappointment of forgetting.
Yeah, and the thing is, the complexity in the traits used to be just based into the weapon, so you'd see them in the stats immediately. Now you're having to read a trait and remember what that keyword does, or look up what that keyword does, or write down what that keyword does. You either learn it or you basically check it every time you use it. And that used to be just baked into the stat line of the weapon.
Or it does nothing unless you have a feat that then adds on to it.
Exactly.
Like Piercer or Smasher or Slasher.
So you've created a problem for yourself, and you're trying to solve the problem by kind of inventing more bolted on rules, be it specific exception based stuff from feats, be it traits that you have to remember what they do. And it's really kind of backwards design, because you're going, okay, we simplified them down, now we'll complex them up again. And they know they have trouble, because the first guy comes along, designs the core book, he designs all the weapons. Yeah, he walks off. Another guy's come in and they're doing maybe a modern retake on Al-Qadim. And as such, they've got to start a bunch of new regional weapons out. So you just go, it's just a scimitar, or it's just a longsword again. Or do you go, maybe we can do something a bit different? Some of these weapons are a little bit different. The Arumi's a bit weird. We should do something with the Arumi. The only stats on weapons we have are damage and damage type. So I guess we have to invent a new trait to represent what the Arumi does. And you're like, okay, is this good? Or like you've got the Hungamunga or Mbele, you got the throwing knife. It's like, okay, what's this like? It's a knife. Is it in real life? Was just life? No. It was really scary. They threw it and it tumbles over shields and stuff. Okay, maybe we can invent a weapon that does something like that. And it's
give it some sort of bonus if they have a shield.
Yeah, so you're making up these really weird weapon concepts and traits, when if you had an expanded weapon profile initially, the onboarding initially would be a little more complex, but then you'd be like, okay, that's cool. Because in real life, right, one of the things that's really important in weapon-on-weapon stuff is reach. And reaches are really influential when you're dueling somebody. If someone has greatly increased reach over you, they have a huge advantage. And it can be very difficult. If you're fighting someone with a spear and you have a sword, everyone's like, oh, well, the swordsman easily defeats the spearman. That is not how it works in real life. The swordsman is at a huge disadvantage against a good spearsman, assuming a relatively equal levels of skill.
And certainly a massed pack of spearmen, like a spear line, is going to annihilate a lone spearman, a lone swordsman.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, obviously that's the advantage in numbers, but even 5 people with spears versus 5 people with swords, that you're not going to close quickly enough to get past those spear tips.
Yeah.
In if the environment allows for that. I mean, obviously, if they outflank them, that I'm in a different world then. But
yeah, part of the issue is that we often kind of equivocate what we can call duelist combat versus the skirmish combat and mass combat that might be more common in a big action RPG. And stuff that is very important in duels suddenly becomes more of a liability in if you're trying to run a larger mass combat. And so where you put the focus of your combat rules will then influence, like, well, how many traits is it okay for a given thing? Like, how this is where you get stuff like the short spear, which is basically just a worse sword, because the fact that it has 6 inches on a sword would very make a lot of difference in the duel, but it doesn't make a lot of difference, when it's a squad of 6 against 27 hobgoblins. So, your level of extraction, your rules sort of leads to a certain level of abstraction in your weapon design.
A huge amount. And given how important in one-on-one combat weapon matchups are, because there absolutely are, and there's a number of kind of, like, if you watch certain movies, like if you ever watch the end of Rob Roy, that's a brilliant illustration of basically one weapon being advantaged against another weapon. The rapier versus the claymore, where the rapier guy is kicking the claymore guy's ass because he's just so much faster. And it's a great little illustration of this is a bad weapon matchup for me until I manage to hit him, and then he's in trouble. And that's great because it suddenly means that within combat, if you had disparities between certain types of weapons, it's like, okay, this guy's got a spear. Can someone else fight him? Because to be honest, I can't win this one. But you're better than him. Like, yes, technically I'm higher level, but the sword on its own is so disadvantaged against the spear that really someone else is better off fighting him than me. Could somebody shoot him, please? Or could someone break his spear with their greatsword? Because I am not winning this fight as it is. And would be very interesting from a GM point of view, where you can go, okay, someone's really good with swords. We're going to throw a guy with a spear at him. They're like, yeah, this sucks. This is not fun. Maybe I need to switch weapons here. Maybe I need to swap opponents. Can I fight somebody else? And that's cool from a tactics point of view, especially for lower Magic games where you don't all have, like if you're playing like a Conan game and you're all basically various flavors of person with a weapon and no magic, that sort of thing is really handy. You can go, oh, well, I've got a sword and disadvantage in this fight. Can someone else fight the guy with the spear? I'll go fight the guy with a dagger.
Well, I think that the Conan example, you move into a situation where most of the time Conan is doing the bulk of the fighting, or another warrior type is doing the bulk of the fighting, and the rogue type spends like half of a fight rolling underneath things, picking up treasure from the edge of the battlefield, and not actively fighting. The guy with the dagger does very little with his daggers until the opportunity is presented. He drops onto the back of a guy's horse and stabs him 15 times in the kidneys and then hides again. It's not even that he gets in like the occasional attack on a knife with another roguey guy. It is that he does stealing and like setting up their escape. And then when the opportunity presents, he gets his one sneak attack in and murders a guy. Meanwhile, Conan has thrown like 5 guys off a cliff, thrown a spear through a horse, or whatever.
It's like the Battle of the Monument in Conan the Barbarian, where 2 of them are fighting all these cavalry guys, and they've set up all these different weapons and traps to take advantage of the fact that, the cavalry is better than us, but we've focused on the terrain, and we're going to use different weapons to take them out. We're going to use long spears to basically drive them back, take them off horses and stuff, and then we're going to beat them with swords and stuff. And that's cool. And it's something that's kind of lost when everyone's like, will you use this spear? No, I will use my +3 sword. And just go, I'm a specialist in this. Everything is as chaff before me. Another thing. You're fighting a guy in plate armor in D&D. Which weapon should you use?
Obviously, my +1 longsword.
Yeah. Why did you use the Warhammer?
Because it does 1 dice size less damage and then doesn't have +1.
If you're fighting a guy in plate armor in the real world, which do you use?
You drown him.
You do drown him. But if you don't have the option of drowning him, you're suspicious lack of water, but it's also quite temperate.
You take a hammer to his helmet and until like his own helmet is starting to squeeze the blood out of his brain.
You grab him with a man catcher.
Yeah,
and you have another guy come in from another side with another man catcher, and then while he's struggling with those, you set him on fire. Sorry, I've gone for non-weapon solutions, but that's it. Yeah, you want to use the hammers, and in second edition Dungeons and Dragons, there was a list of comparable bonuses that you would get for that.
Yeah.
I did want to bring up that because there is this table that was printed in first and second ed of different weapons doing better against different types of armor, and there was a big long classic old school table, and a lot of people simply ignored it. I think actually in second ed it was actually optional, and a lot of people just ignored it because it was too much. It was too much effort to look up as an occasional rule. They didn't have an elegant way to put +1 versus plate armor, -2 against chainmail into the stat line of the weapon, like you'd hope. And most combat was against monsters who didn't have traditional armor types. So what was the point of my weapon is +3 versus chainmail? That's great. I'm fighting a dragon. That doesn't count as chainmail. Counts as dragon.
Yeah.
And worse, it punishes the players quite extensively because anything that has a bonus against chainmail, the chainmail is already weaker than the plate. So if someone goes, oh, spears, pointy spears, this is an extra pointy spear, it's going to slide between the rings of your armor, the links of your chain link armor, and the goblin has it. Well, the ranger in studded leather doesn't wear chainmail, but the person wearing lighter chainmail is already with a lower AC. In comes the goblin, stabs him through the guts. He's in serious trouble. The guy in plate mail's laughing all the way to the bank.
In fairness, the guy in plate mail was often already laughing all the way to the bank in real life. But that was, it's one of those things where the lack of matchups and the lack of idea of this weapon is good against a particular job has kind of been lost in this change. And particularly for lower magic settings and for people who are coming into the hobby now, they may not be coming from kind of abstracted war games where it's like, okay, yeah, just weapons are just weapons. It's not worth getting into the detail. When you're controlling one unit or one character, the more detail is a good thing. And that's one of the things about RPGs. That tend to be a little more detailed than war games in how they resolve stuff. And one of the things is you've got players who are coming in from stuff like having played Elden Ring or having played Dark Souls, where weapon qualities and matchups are quite important. Some weapons suck against some types of bad guys. And what's the solution? Is usually change weapon. Like the first time in Elden Ring, I fought a guy in heavy armor with a spear and a shield. I was like, this is really quite challenging to beat with a sword. And I thought it was like, that was really cool. And they're coming in having learned that. And they will often ask questions like, oh, I want a dagger build, or, oh, I want a greatsword build. And they don't really exist in a lot of games. It's like, oh, you can do this. These builds are available. There's not much with those builds. Sorry. We don't really do double daggers, They're not really anything that does anything interesting. And one of the things we kind of miss out on, because we do sort of a lot of turn-based combat, is we go, okay, everyone gets one attack. Doesn't that privilege the guy with the higher damage weapon? It does. Don't really have a fix to that. So we got rid of different numbers of attacks. We've gotten rid of better against certain types of weapon. We've gotten rid of better against certain types of armor. And we're now left with trying to reinvent complexity that we could explore by going back a little and saying, how can we, in a way that doesn't require lots of tables and table lookups and stuff, how do we get down to, okay, this weapon is good against this and bad against this again? Because that's actually space that should be explored. And it's especially good for RPGs where, like, if everyone's throwing spells around, melee combat is going to be a less of a focus. But in games where melee combat is a big focus, and there are a lot of grittier games that focus on, we're just normal lads, fighting. And having that extra bit of design space there from expanded weapons, and some weapons are good matchups against other weapons, that'd be a great thing to have.
Okay, now you're making good points, but now I want to delve into devil's advocate because of how people approach the things like we're thinking about stuff like, say, a sword has good all round stats. Say I'm thinking in terms of something like Exalted, where weapons have accuracy and damage and a defense
Yeah.
bonus, and often some tags as well.
You
Uh,
know, I looked up why people use swords, and there's some interesting answers to that.
Yeah, a lot of it's
It's
social.
there's a good chunk of it's social, but one of the things about swords, because I was looking at why are swords good, and it's an interesting idea, is that swords aren't particularly good all rounders. They're okay, you know. There are better weapons in a lot of cases. A main advantage to swords and long daggers is that they're easy to carry. That a spear is fucking awkward, you know, to carry. It takes one or two hands pretty much all the time. A shield's awkward. It takes a hand, or you know, you can maybe strap it onto yourself, but it's awkward.
I think
Takes up a lot of space. A dagger or a sword, you can go in a sheath and just be there at your side, easy to pull out. So the whole idea is if your primary weapon gets broken or lost or something else, a sword is really, really good at being whipped out, and it's there immediately.
Mm.
the
And
fundamental tool is the knife. The fundamental tool is the knife. And so everyone at every point in history since the discovery of making a sharp rock needed to carry a knife. And you get good with a knife, and then you go, well, if I'm going to have to fight someone and I have this tool that I use for cutting meat already, I'm going to use that. And over time, you're going to get that bigger and bigger because the bigger knife has the advantage, except for in a grappling situation, at which point you're into a different fight anyway. And we have terrible rules for grappling, so let's not worry about that. You start to enlarge that knife. You will always have someone who has a walking stick. And if you either go bigger than you are, a staff, a quarter staff, or you go a standard walking stick, a waist-high walking stick. And if you can train with a waist-high walking stick, and you see that with the Screama in the Philippines, you see that with the old defunct Irish stick fighting styles, Batadorocht, which apparently survives in Canada, but I think that might just be a rumor.
No, they have fighting schools. There's one in the US as well.
I've heard that. I think it may be reconstructed. I'm not sure.
It's absolutely reconstructed. It's not thing, but that's fine. You know, you still have to do that.
Because I did notice there's an awful lot comparable to a Screama. But again, if you can walk with a stick, no one will take. Who will part an old man from his walking stick?
Exactly.
But if you can train with a stick to fight as a club, as a slender club, that very quickly can become sword fighting techniques. And so it is a reasonable weapon to go, well, we as kids we fought with sticks, and as we got older, we needed a weapon of war, we needed a sidearm. A big knife that we can use like a stick becomes a tool that you can train with. And it's not a good weapon for fighting a dragon. You have to use spears. If the creature you're fighting is larger than you, if you're fighting a dragon, why are you using a sword or a mace? You need to be using a whale hunting harpoon. So if you want to start going, what are you fighting? I'm fighting an 18-foot tall troll. What are you? Well, I'm a large man. I'm 6'6" and I weigh 240 pounds, a stacked muscle. What are you going to use? A sword? No, I have to have something designed for killing dragons. And again, going all the way back to second ed, you start to see that there were a variety of these weapons that we've all scrapped and that we couldn't keep track of. It is too hard to keep track of. If you're playing a game where you're trying to keep the story flowing and someone's like, no, we've got to go find +2 Volges because we need something that's 8 foot long and has this type of head on it. It's not an amazing experience.
Yeah. And that's sort of to come back to the point I was trying to make was just like if you have a situation where a weapon has a bunch of numbers, the instinct of a lot of people is to just take those numbers and then fold them into their own like character numbers, their stats, their class level and all that, and create their attack, not their dieclave attack or their spear attack or their bow attack, just the instinct is to create the total number and use that as opposed to it's not I am using a bow, it is this is my attack, this is my long range attack. And you sort of want to design your setup, your rules, so that that's not the mentality a person has. I think this might actually be easier with certain types of dice pool systems where you're sort of constructing, and you can have your personal skill and stats as one dice, and then you can reach over for the dice for your bow or the dice for your sword. So this may be one of those situations where like Fantasy Flight might have an advantage, but at the same time it's not a trivial thing to design around. You have to you're essentially asking people to think about their weapons as a swappable thing, because that's what we're looking at. Is just like don't think of like the sword as an extension of your arm. It's a tool, and you can pick a different tool for a different combat situation.
But and it's very against where a lot of the kind of the metagame and current iteration of a lot of the higher fantasy games are, where you often have a specific chosen weapon, and that weapon is used for everything. When in reality, a more toolbox approach would be cool, but it's generally not supported. I mean, it is difficult. It's much more difficult to design this. And it's much more difficult to design this in a way that it is easily comprehensible to players, where you're going, actually, guys, this is what your weapon looks like. Oh, too many stats. And I'm like, hey, it's too many stats right now. After playing with it for like a game or two, it'll be fine. And it's about getting people over that little extra initial hump of learning. And that can be quite tricky because, it's just so much simpler in D&D. Like, all my clubs do D6. Yeah, do you use clubs? No, of course not. They're terrible. I'm like, yeah, because you're not giving clubs any kind of advantages. When you can give different weapons advantages in different situations. And if you find a smart way to design it, you can introduce a little metagame within them of which weapon people use, and make sure that every weapon has a niche of some sort where it's at least kind of handy in this situation. Or they're okay, daggers get a lot of attacks, and it's like, yeah, but they all damage sucks. And yes, however, if you're looking to put on a status effect with your stab, for example, poison, daggers are really good. And it's stuff like that where you can kind of go, okay, what can we do to expand out the weapons a little bit? Because if we expand them out, we make the combat a little more interesting. We move the gameplay or the importance of build a little more towards moment-to-moment gameplay. Where if you just go, I just slaughter everyone with my greatsword, it doesn't matter what my opponent has. If all of a sudden what your opponent is armed with and armored with matters, if it's close quarters, if the ground is muddy, if you're in the forest and there's a lot of trees around, are like, well, this sucks. Why? You got a big long weapon. Yes, they're way less good when there's trees in the way. And you all of a sudden you can go, okay, this is interesting, because it basically means that I actually have to alter my play style to suit the environment, or I'm in a much worse position. So you move some skill away from character building and you put a little bit more skill into moment-to-moment gameplay, which is cool for a GM because the players have to think a little bit more, try a little bit more, become a little more engaged.
Yeah.
And that's just a good thing in a game where they're like, we got to try a little bit harder here. And that's good because the players have to be more engaged to deal with it. Actually, is there any terrain here we can utilize? I can't just go, ha, invincible sword, princess time, great sword. It's like, yeah, I need to do something different here. That's good. That's absolutely a good thing.
But it obviously brings challenges to design, for example.
Oh, absolutely. And explaining it to players and teaching the players to the GM. There's a bunch of extra challenges, but there's also a bunch of extra rewards on it. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. It's just that everyone's back down this hole of simplify. Everything should be simpler. And we're destroying some of the gameplay opportunities in doing that. Like, some of this gameplay stuff is just annoying minutiae. Little, it's futzing over, how much water the Italians, extra water the Italians used during the North African campaign. Some of it's just, it's ephemera. It's there. It's kind of important, but it's also really annoying to track. You've got to find a way to distinguish between the bits of stuff that's complication and the bits of stuff that's complexity, and the complexity that adds to the gameplay versus the complexity that detracts from the gameplay.
Yeah, I'm thinking very much in terms of action costs, for example. If you want a system where people are supposed to be changing weapons or even changing armor to suit situations, then you should probably not have, it takes entire action to drop your Volg and pull out your mace, and it takes 30 minutes on horse grain to move out of your full plate, put on your chainmail. You should probably just adjust your rules, maybe away from your simulation of exaggerated fantasy nonsense, and more to make it so that with the players engage with, we're facing these weapons, this armor type, so let's swap out this and this on the fly as part of our planning to engage with this combat situation we're walking into.
But you can even use a bit of that to add some choice there. Like you're saying, action swap costs, and that's a great example. Like, for example, you can say, to get an axe out of your pack that's strapped to your pack, that's probably an action to unstrap it, right? Or to get a spear or a shield that you've strapped to your back and unlimber it is probably an action. But you go, yeah, that's an action, except swords are sheathed to your belt, they draw for free. And all of a sudden you certainly see the virtue of having a sword or a knife stashed in your belt, that if you're stuck, you can whip one of those out really quickly.
A
and
speed
you're not losing
factor.
the action. Yeah.
And I think that's a thing that came up in the Buck Rogers game that I've been playing, which was that the lighter weapons fire earlier in the round.
Yeah.
That the characters who had a pistol were going to fire much sooner in the round than the portion of the team that I equipped with rocket launchers, although by the end of the game everyone was using rocket launchers because they were the longsword of the fight. If you have perhaps a movement away from every round you have to attack, then you can start to say, okay, what do you want to do this round? Oh, I want to do something. This is not an attack round. This is a maneuvering round. You're breaking rounds up, but it may be totally unnecessary. People may hate it. The fighter may say, I want to attack every round. The barbarian type is certainly going to just say, I hit man with stick. But the other option is you go, okay, you can change weapons. You're not gonna lose your action this round. You're gonna drop down a slot in the initiative order.
Mm-hmm.
The guy who was ahead of you, the guy you were ahead of, he's now ahead of you. You've moved down in the initiative. It's free to draw a dagger, but it's not free to unsling your greatsword off your back and start swinging. You got to build up a bit of momentum. I'm not going to take your whole round off you. You're not going to lose a round drawing the greatsword, but you're not going to, that guy who jumped out of an alleyway with a knife and said, haha, I'm going to stab you. He's going to stab you. And then the next round, he's going to stab you again, and you're going to unsling a greatsword. Or you can try and wrestle him.
Yeah.
So you'd need to put a speed factor on it.
And rather than people, they break out in hives when you mention stuff like speed factor and moving initiative, because everyone just like, okay, I don't actually care what the initiative number is, just put the order down here. But actually, the person's point is that it allows you to make a speed cost into your system without having to take out an action cost or skipping around. Because that's one of the big things, is because we've moved very much away from, unless you're playing like Pathfinder, we've moved away from the model of each combat is 10 rounds. It's down to 3 or 4, and therefore missing even a single turn is a huge blow to your impact on a fight. But you could put in, if you have this, adjustment of initiative system or some other penalty on your actions that isn't, an entire action, then suddenly you can engage this this type of gameplay of, well, readiness versus what's the best tool for the job, and that you suddenly, just like adding terrain makes the fight interesting, adding speed trade-offs can also be used to add payoffs and benefits.
Like, one of the things you could do is you could say certain weapons have positive and negative initiative effects on you. And then you go, and then the person who's faster gets a bonus to attack people who are slower.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, oh yeah, the dagger's really fast. It's not, doesn't do a lot of damage, but it's pretty easy to attack with, which is kind of true in real life. It's really easy to attack with a dagger. It's not very good in a lot of cases, but it's it's very, very, very quick to attack with. And that's a way to do it without getting into speed factoring. Okay, this is 3 attacks a round. This is one every 2 rounds, which is something you can do, but is often a little bit difficult to run a turn-based game. We've kind of gone out to a turn-based game.
Yeah. I feel like maybe we should mention initiative. Exalted Third Ed has that system where initiative is essentially based on your combat results, and you basically build up a whole bunch of initiative by making swipes at people, and then when you're actually stabbing them, you spend that initiative to hit them and do damage.
Exactly. There's a bunch of attacks which just building, and you spend the resources to actually do a real attack. And I'd say it's a cool way of doing it. It's going to build some natural rhythm into the combat, where it's just like, glow, zap, you're dead. It's like, no, you've got to build up to the bigger attack. It's just, I think that the collapse down of weapons to just weapon damage and watching people slowly try to back out of that, they went into a design hole, and now they're trying to get out of it. And you'll see that you'll see that across a lot of RPGs, where they're trying to find a way to put some more design space in, because the first guy designs the core book and he's grand, but then the next person who comes along and has to design the weapons for an expansion book, it's like, God, what do I do? Because I invent a bunch of new rules now, that, again, people have to remember, rather than having a bigger set of stats on a weapon, little dials you can twiddle and change and stuff.
The fear I have is that if you look at something like a Cyberpunk Chromebook, which I have one here beside me, I didn't flick it open yet, but you could have a lot of weapons that are very, very similar. One has 1 point less of recoil, one has 1 point more of an aim bonus if you spend a whole round aiming. And at some point someone goes, that all adds up to now 1 point is bigger in Cyberpunk than it is in D&D, but if you're looking at 1 point here, 1 point there for 5th Ed, that's a 5% swing. And are you going to have that row every time? Have that conversation each time for a +1 in a system that's already gone? Look, any time anything happens that makes something easier, just give them advantage or disadvantage, and if they have one, they can't have the other. Which is not what it was supposed to be. Obviously, in 5th Ed, it actually says things like anything that, if you were ever going to give them more than a +3 bonus, just give them advantage or disadvantage instead.
Yeah.
And everyone took that to just mean the only thing to ever do is advantage or disadvantage. I know a lot of people who are completely unaware that taking cover can give them 5 points of AC.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're a gnome, because you're small, you can take cover behind the fighter, or you could take cover behind a low wall that basically doesn't give decent cover to the human. None of that's applied. No one applies it. And so similarly to include shields in equipment, that makes a big difference. Can you have a shield that you can see beyond? Can you have a tower shield that makes a difference? Do we want to put that as a stat in our core book, in our hypothetical core book? Do we want to have these are the 16 features that a weapon has, and you can tweak 1 or 2 of them? I mean, I don't want to say 16. I pulled that number out of my periphery. But do we want to have a concealment stat? Do we want to have a a reach stat, do you want to get so finicky about it that you go a short sword has less reach than a long sword, so if you're fighting a short sword against a long sword, the long sword gets an advantage, and a point advantage? I think that's too granular.
I think you need to bake it into the core math of the system.
Yeah.
And that's what the system becomes structured around then. Like those couple of bonuses or penalties. And maybe you do something like the way Shadow of the Demon Lord does advantage and disadvantage, where they cancel each other out until I've got 3 advantage and I've got 1 disadvantage. Okay, so I've got 2 advantage. So I get to roll dice, extra dice basically, to I get to roll along my d20, I get to roll an extra d6, and the highest one of those d6s is a positive modifier, or if it's disadvantage, it's a negative modifier. So you've basically got that extra little bit of granularity core built into the system, and basically that's the bit. But you have to make it core. You can't make it an optional little kind of bit of minutiae extras. People try and discard it. When you're actually trying to make the part, you want to make it. Oh, this is actually how you get an edge in this system. Everything, very little else actually gives you an edge.
Yeah, I think that the issue, and maybe is that an awful lot of these games are designed with like their simple, clear core mechanics first, and people play test with those and say, yeah, we love this simple core mechanic, and then after that they start into the weapon design thing, and they have to, adjust the weapon design to fit into their core system. Whereas if we want to have this level of interactivity where weapon choice matters, then we may have to start with the weapon choice as the core design of our sensibility of our game. So,
absolutely.
I mean, honestly, I've seen games go the opposite direction and start removing gear as a thing and just say, oh, the fighter does D10 damage, and we can assume that's because the fighter has chosen the correct. The fighter is assumed to have the correct weapon for the job at all times, and we just don't bother, keeping track of his golf bag of weapons. It's a class feature. His class feature is I have the right weapon.
Yeah, and you can do that if you don't want a very tactical game, and more power to you. But if you do want some tactics in your game, a little bit of tactical depth, I think weapons and weapon matchups, weapon design, different weapons against different armor, that's a good space to get it in, rather than trying to make, okay, I'm going to invent magical sword techniques, wherever there's feet, where I can basically make an attack and I break armor and stuff. Like, yeah, you can do that. But you could also put a little more effort at the core stuff and have something interesting there. All right.
If you're doing a tactical combat game, if you're doing a game which is sort of a romp of a game, you could do John Carter of Mars. The fighter is generic fighter. He fights when there's a fight scene. He gets to roll some dice and say, did we win the fight? Yes or no. He doesn't care what his equipment is. He uses what's available. You don't bring anything from story to story. If you read the John Carter books, he basically never has any equipment at all referenced. He has a sword, but no one ever says, he's picked up a better rifle. Like, that's not a thing that anyone in those stories cares about. So you can just have him go, yep, there's a fight scene happening now. It's a shootout. You've got a gun. Oh, there's a sword fight happening now. You're fighting for honor. You're going to do sword fight. You're just rolling your fighting skill.
Yeah, and that's for that pulpy, pick up what's available. It's not about saving your pennies to buy your +2 sword and your full plate. It's about working with the situation you've got, and that's defines that pulp hero. So you're outside of the sort of gear grinding mentality of a D&D, like you're into raw pulp, where it's not about the equipment, it's about how you use it.
But if you have a fighter and a wizard, and you're going to have someone who goes, I want plate mail to be better protected, I want a longer weapon to deal with this issue, I want armor piercing arrows for when we have to fight the evil high priest who we know is going to be wearing magic plate mail, you start to do. You start to need to have that in your system from the start. And at that point, then a better stat block for the equipment is necessary. You can't just say, okay, well, there is such a thing as armor-piercing arrows. If there was, you'd be using them already. Well, they're magic arrows. Well, is a +1 arrow the same thing as a armor-piercing arrow? Can we get bodkin heads specifically for this issue? Or do as you say, does the fighter just always have a supply of arrows, and why would I ever shoot an unarmored man with a bodkin? I'll shoot him with this nice broadhead for doing some serious fleshy damage. But then if you're definitely going to choose the better arrow, then shouldn't it do more damage if the person's not armored? Or is that rolled into the AC because the person's AC is going to be lower?
You see, that's where I think you've got to basically build it in from the start and find a way to make the weapons you've got in there matter. Not just be, these are the 3 you use and a bunch of interchangeable crap no one cares about. Who uses clubs in D&D?
Druids.
Anyone else?
Because they can cast Shillelagh on it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
People role-playing as as Caveman Sam.
It's a pretty dismal showing, right?
I
Yeah.
guarantee that person uses a club for 2 sessions and then gets their hands on a greatsword.
Yeah, or an Earthbreaker or whatever the equivalent 2d6 damage weapon is, you know.
A maul?
Yeah, I think so. It's a maul. Yeah, but you should have. Yeah, there's reasons to use this weapon. You know, maybe it's that basically. Yeah, if you're up against somebody who's Sunder stuff, clubs are great. You broke my club. Oh dear, I'll get another one. You know, and there are times when clubs are great against the white. These are great at squashing things that are otherwise very difficult to deal with, you know? Maybe I don't want to cut this thing. Maybe cutting this thing's a really bad idea. And maybe a bludgeoning thing is what I want to use here. You know? So yeah. I think we've had a decent fair enough fist to this one.
Yeah.
And we've got and if you guys have any strong opinions on weapons and weapon design and what the crazy stuff we're talking about here, please hit us up on our social media, or even better, contact us in our Discord. Kiffer, you'd like to give yourself one last plug there again?
Oh yeah, if you can find me on Twitch as Kiffer_Geo. I mean, I guess if you just type in Kiffer Geo, you'll find me. I play
That's
retro
2
games.
Fs, by the way.
There's 2 Fs in Kiffer, yes. KIFFER_Geo. And I stream retro games on Mondays and Fridays.
Excellent. But for now, this party's over.
Thank you for listening to The Adventuring Party. If you'd like to leave us a voicemail, you can head on over to SpeakPipe and drop us a line. Or you can join us on our Discord server, where we keep the party going after hours. Otherwise, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or Twitter, or you can email the hosts at party@theadventuringparty.net. The Adventuring Party is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike version 3 license, but you probably knew that already. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and look forward to seeing you back here next week. Goodbye.